record. Thank you. All right, so welcome folks. Hopefully you're in the right place if you're here for one of our OSU Land Steward Program Community Education Series classes. These classes are brainstormed and thought up all together by our Community Education Committee. And then all of our Land Steward volunteers go out and bring in wonderful presenters like Gordon Jones here to give classes on topics that are related to different land steward topics. My name is Nicole Smith, and I'm the Land Steward Education Program Assistant. And if you are not already signed up for our MailChimp subscription, you can do so by going to the OSU Land Steward Program. You can just Google OSU Land Steward Program, and on the events page, actually on the Land Steward Program page, you'll find a subscribe button. And we don't spam you with anything, but we do send you flyers for our upcoming classes. You can also find our upcoming classes on the events page. And so here we are, December 18th, I bought a former cannabis hemp farm. Now what? Which we'll hear from Gordon Jones soon. Coming up January 22nd, climate change in Southern Oregon, trends, impacts, and projections. And that one you'll see labeled as Central Point. It is actually a hybrid class, so you can choose in your registration whether you are coming in person or whether you are attending via Zoom. And so it will be recorded. And then we have a presentation on February 20th on Zoom called Green Your Garden with Gray Water. We'll learn about how to reuse gray water in your garden. And we have classes being dreamt up and organized all the way through December now of 2025. So stay tuned for quite a bit more classes to be advertised soon on our website. And thank you, Gordon, for taking time out to join us. Gordon Jones serves as Central Oregon Agronomist. Did I say that right? Agronomist?
I would say agronomist, but doesn't much matter.
For the OSU Extension Service in Prineville, covering Crook, Deschutes, and Jefferson Counties and the Confederate tribes of Warm Springs. He holds a BS in Environmental Studies and Sustainable Agriculture from Warren Wilson College and an MS and Ph.D. in Crop and Soil Environmental Sciences from Virginia Tech. Gordon conducts research, teaches extension classes, and provides technical assistance around pasture, forage, and small grain management, soil fertility, and drought resistance. Prior to his transition to Central Oregon, Gordon spent 6 years working for the OSU Extension Service in Rogue Valley. Welcome back to the Land Stewards Program, Gordon, and I will let you take it over from here.
Thank you, Nicole, and thank you to Marcy for reaching out to me and organizing this. I'm delighted to be back, and Land Stewards are an excellent group, and I recognize lots of names, and I'm glad to be invited to come and talk with you all. Let me share my screen. We are like a reasonably small group here, and so we should keep this as like fast and loose as we can. I would invite questions in the chat box, or I don't know if the security settings will allow you to unmute if you just wanted to interrupt me. I'll try to stop a few times through this. Yeah. I bought a former cannabis or hemp farm. Now what? This talk probably could equally be titled, like, I rented my best field to a cannabis or hemp farmer. Now what? Or, my neighbor, the new neighbor, is a cannabis or hemp farmer. It's a fiasco. Now what? And all sort of interlocking topics, and trust folks are in some vantage point of seeing lots of, or having seen lots of hemp and cannabis farms, and or are in the midst of trying to figure out what to do in terms of buying property, or dealing with remnant challenges or perhaps opportunities that have arisen from past land use. I guess before I dive into this, I I have some ideas about what the questions might be and why you all might be here. I'm curious if I can solicit some engagement through the chat box or by having you unmute your microphones and telling me like what questions do you have? What do you want to learn? What are you feeling frustrated or optimistic about in this topic?
Hi, Gordon. My name's Janine. I have a really quick question. My goals and my vision for my property are to be regenerative and practice permaculture.
Mhm.
So the first step for me is to think about the soil. So a question that I have is what tests do you recommend that
Mhm.
I should perform? How many testing sites? Are there any things that I should be looking for so that I know that I should test that area? And then maybe also a recommendation of any testing or labs that I could reach out to. Thank you.
Cool. Good question. And it looks like Lindsay had a similar one about soil testing. I have at least a bit about this, and I'll just make sure I like make some time to expound on soil testing that you might want to do, both thinking about the hemp, the legacy of the hemp stuff, and the sort of like future looking regenerative soil health kind of pieces as well. Other stuff you want to hear about?
Gordon, as someone who is looking for property, I'd love to hear, are there any concerns that you would have if you were looking for property
Yep.
practices or things that one needs to be concerned about?
Yep. Uh, Scott, good to see your name. Is there a way to deal with hazardous chemicals that may remain on the site, disposable equipment, storage tanks, irrigation, other stuff? Cool. We can talk about some of that. Other things here. Well, in summary, my sort of game plan, not having taught a class like this before, was to talk a little bit about like trash and junk and plastic and those kind of things. Was going to talk a little bit about um, sort of like potential concerns about contamination and how you'd sort of like suss out if something weird happened in the past. Um, and right, some of these questions about contamination, chemicals, dissipation of stuff. And then was also going to spend a little bit of time talking about um, sort of like moving forward, if you have something that you desire for your farm, how you'd figure that out, um, deal with the like difficult stuff from the past, but then thinking about a little bit of a path forward. So that's sort of my game plan. And again, interrupt me with questions and who knows. So let's see, just a little refresher on hemp in Oregon. I showed up at SOREC in 2017. I had done my little pre-Googling as I was finishing up grad school in Blacksburg, Virginia. I thought I was going to work on like cover crops and pears and wine grapes. Thought I'd do some work on irrigation, pastures, hay fields. I like did not do enough Googling on this because if I had, I would have realized that there was this cannabis industry that both was legal and present there in the Rogue Valley, but then also like an illegal cannabis industry that like stretched up into the hills. And um, and so when I arrived in 2017, there were like a few thousand acres of hemp being grown. In 2018, there were a few thousand more. It was the end of 2018. That was the legalization of hemp through the 2018 Farm Bill. Previously, hemp production had been prohibited. We had had sort of like marijuana or cannabis production. Um, in Oregon for a number of years prior. That marijuana production is constrained to like 1 fenced acre or 1 fenced acre of like canopy area of those plants, but the hemp production can occur on as many acres as a farmer wants to farm. And so these statistics at least are hemp related just because I have them in front of me. And so they come from Oregon Department of Agriculture, and a few thousand acres of hemp in 2017 and a few thousand more in 2018. And it was with the passing of the 2018 Farm Bill that we see like this explosion of interest in hemp in 2019. It felt to me like everybody and their brother were showing up there in the Rogue Valley to grow hemp, to like buy a piece of property, rent your pasture, plow up your field, all in it. It was a like gold rush and a change in land use like I don't ever anticipate seeing again. It was like a real, there's some pent up and probably irrational enthusiasm here in retrospect. It's easy to say irrational. And folks grew hemp, and the like one thing that we were supposed to learn from like microeconomics class in high school or college was that like prices are dictated by supply and demand. And come September, October of 2019, everyone was trying to get their hemp harvested and dried, and it got rained on and moldy, and there was a huge glut of like not great hemp. And that resulted in many folks not being able to sell that crop because they flooded the market and the price dropped. And um, and many folks left, gave up on the effort. And in 2020, we saw many fewer acres of hemp being grown across the state. And that meant that whatever the difference between that 64,000 and the 28,500, that number of acres may have had hemp on it and now didn't the next year. And things didn't get any better in 2022, in 2021. I think it was in 2021 that we had this, like the international drug cartels came in and started trying to grow some marijuana under the guise using hemp licenses. And that like brought its own like interesting flavor to the really quickly built greenhouses that went up through the region. And in 2022, 2023, and 2024, things have gotten no better for the hemp growers. There still are a few folks around in Oregon, and still with a fair number of growers in Jackson and Josephine counties producing hemp. Almost all of this hemp through this whole cycle has been hemp that's either grown for cannabidiol, CBD, or one of the other cannabinoids. I'd call it like medicinal, chemical, or therapeutic kind of hemp. And that would distinguish it from hemp that's being grown for the fiber that's in its stalks, or the seeds that are being produced in the flower that might be used for animal feed or a food product. And so big like roller coaster. And as a result of that, there are lots of parcels of land, lots of fields within parcels that somebody tried to grow hemp on for 1 or 2 years and then stopped trying to grow hemp on it. I think I put this map together in, I don't know, it was probably 2020, 2021. It doesn't matter. It would sort of look the same if we looked at it today in terms of the concentration of where production occurs. Each of these dots was a like registered hemp grow at whenever I made this. Let's call it 2021. And we can see that we see a lot of those in Jackson and Josephine counties. The number of those grows has diminished dramatically, but we still would probably see a big pocket there in Jackson and Josephine counties. There are a couple of growers in Central Oregon and a couple of big grower, or at least one pretty large acreage grower there in the Columbia River. And so we like sort of think about this whole topic. In one way, having hemp be grown on land is not really that different than growing any other like annual crop on your land. We might have gone out to a field like this and seen like really a similar production system, but somebody growing organic strawberries, laying down the plastic mulch, doing a lot of hand labor, starting plants, either purchasing starts or um, growing those in a greenhouse, transplanting them into plastic, using a variety of management techniques, pest management, fertilizer, uh, growing that crop, trying to sell a profitable crop, doing that for some number of years, deciding to move on. It is it is not like sort of inherently or fundamentally any different than any other crop. Part of the reason that it is different is because we saw this explosion of interest over time, and then the decline in interest over time. The like Wild Westy nature that folks thought they were really gonna make a bazillion dollars growing hemp, and so we're pretty hot and fast in showing up. Um, and the notion that there is this sort of like blurry gray zone between legal and licensed hemp production, legal and licensed marijuana production, and then some like illicit, black market, illegal kind of production. And you can't tell the difference between a hemp plant that has no like psychoactive THC in it and a marijuana plant that is that would get somebody stoned and needs to be regulated in a different way. You can't visually or by aroma or any other way, even driving down the highway, you just can't tell the difference just by looking at those plants. It really is a test result that's required to understand the difference between the plants. And so that like allows for bad actors to like try to weave their way into legitimate industries. Um, I guess I would say in the landscape of the Rogue Valley felt like a really big change because we just didn't have that many like organic strawberry fields or huge big fields of annual crops being produced. We saw see lots of pastures and hay fields, pear orchards to varying degrees, wine grapes, and like some small grain production and like some smattering of diversified vegetable production. But certainly felt like a change in land use to see this big sort of production of an annual crop where fields were plowed or disked or cultivated and planted each year. And I guess one of the pieces of that was we saw a lot of this plastic mulch being used. And plastic mulch is not unique to hemp. It's used in all sorts of high value cropping systems. Um, can per, is a sort of an attractive alternative in particularly a system that is limited on chemical weed control, that many of our crops use some kind of herbicide to keep weed competition down. But a crop like hemp, being a brand new one, really has basically no conventional pesticides that are legally allowed to be used on it. And so folks can't develop a production system that relies on herbicides to control weeds and have to do something else. And that's either hand pulling or sending crews out with hose, using tractor mounted cultivators, or using a mulch like plastic mulch, but it gets used on tomatoes in California and strawberries in the Rogue Valley and elsewhere. Um, One of the challenges with plastic mulch is that uh, to like cover an acre with just the sort of sheet mulch itself, you're going to put down between 100 and 200 pounds of plastic. And that doesn't consider other like sort of irrigation infrastructure. Pretty common to put a piece of drip tape underneath that bed of plastic mulch. But about 100 or 200 pounds of plastic goes down to in an acre. And then that plastic is not like the finest quality plastic. It's reasonably inexpensive, designed to cover the ground for usually just one season, and is difficult to recycle because it starts out as like not the most valuable plastic. And then that 100 or 200 pounds of plastic is going to pick up another several hundred pounds of soil with it. And so if somebody wanted to recycle that plastic, it needs to be separated from the soil that is adheres to it, and really has a tremendous sort of like effort, energy, and water requirement to clean that plastic in order to make it usable for something else. And let's see, and so we see examples there of, in the best cases, people pulling that plastic out of the fields and would sometimes get piled somewhere. And this really is at least in the like reasonable geography around the Rogue Valley, it is like garbage that is garbage for the landfill. And that is one of the real sort of like negative consequences of this agricultural plastic, but there are trade-offs to many things we do in land management, and this is a big trade-off. That ideally that plastic gets pulled out of the field at the end of the growing season, and I'll show you a photo or two later on. But if folks ended up going bankrupt, abandoning their lease, leaving that plastic in the field can cause some real challenges because it's not that sturdy. Does not decompose, but disintegrates, just turns into smaller plastic, but doesn't ever really decompose. And that is a challenge in many fields, that there is like some plastic trash debris. There are folks in Oregon who recycle agricultural plastic. The one that is most sort of sophisticated is called Agriplast Inc., and they're out of Brooks, Oregon. And they recycle agricultural plastic of a range of sorts. But if we go and check out their like materials accepted section of the website, they want binder twine. They will take plastic film, including greenhouse cover and the plastic film that we're talking about, this plastic mulch, but it just needs to be clean. And chances are that it's not that clean if it's out of the field, unless there's a real significant effort made to wash it. And they'll take other kinds of agricultural plastic, including that some on the like sort of marijuana cannabis side of the industry, production often occurred in a super sack, a big tote that's like a cubic yard or a cubic meter, that would sit above ground and be filled with potting mix. Sounds like these folks will not recycle those. I'm not aware of a good recycling solution for this agricultural plastic, and it ends up needing to go into a landfill, unfortunately. And while there are a few like equivalent sheet mulches that are biodegradable, most of probably what was used on most of those 64,000 acres, and not everyone used plastic mulch, but a lot of it that got used is just plastic mulch. And if it does not get physically removed from those fields, it will be in those fields forever, and goes from a process where if it's still in it's relatively fresh and not has not disintegrated much. There are mechanical solutions that will that can help to wrap up that kind of plastic. But if it's been in there since 2019 or something, we may find that it's fallen apart into small bits and is a enormously laborious task to get out of fields. As that agricultural plastic does break down, there's good evidence that it is leaching some of its compounds into the soil, and is breaking down into microplastics that probably are ubiquitous through most of the natural environment in our agricultural fields. But increasingly, we understand the like health and environmental risks of having microplastics around and moving through our ecosystems and agroecosystems, and so not totally desirable to let that stuff degrade any further than it has in the fields. Another top, any questions on plastic? And it strikes me as not like the most desirable thing. It just like has to come out of fields and go into the landfill. Another thing that we might stumble into in purchasing really like any agricultural property, and possibly a hemp or cannabis farm, is some like stored pesticides, chemicals, agricultural chemicals that are we like go into some shed or some barn and we find some containers. There's a legitimate and important question of pesticide disposal that we should talk about. As I mentioned before, the legal hemp growers and legal marijuana growers should not are not permitted. There are not any labeled conventional pesticides, the like highly regulated products that are used through much of conventional agriculture. There are not any of those products that should be used on either a hemp farm or a marijuana farm. Or, excuse me, let me say that again. On a hemp crop or a marijuana crop. Can't be applied to the crop directly. There's a chance that somewhere else on that farm, somebody is growing some hay and putting some herbicide on that hay. There's a chance that there's a gravel driveway and somebody is trying to keep the weeds and puncture vine from growing around the edges of that gravel driveway and may well be putting down an herbicide to do that. This discussion about pesticide disposal really is relevant to all farms, and we'll discuss it here because it's just a piece of buying an old property. There's a chance that you're going to like go find somebody's old store of pesticides. And pesticides that are in their containers that are identifiable, there are opportunities to dispose of those things. Two places to sort of think about disposal if you like run into a bunch of old pesticides that are so old that you don't want to use them, or somebody bought too much and they're not necessarily old, but you just don't want them on the property anymore. Road Disposal does a household hazardous waste disposal weekend, which is the first weekend of May. I called them this morning. Sounds like it's coming up in the first weekend of May. QR code this if you want. It will bring you to that website. There's not a ton of information yet about this May 2025 event, but it sounds like it is happening. And that is the one time that I think for free, you can like show up with your gallon jugs of unwanted pesticide, and they work with a special hazardous waste contractor to collect that pesticide and dispose of it appropriately in the safe and appropriate way. That really is, they will not take containers over 5 gallons, and really is aimed at like sort of household level pesticide use, not like mega commercial. They will not at Road Disposal take your 55-gallon drum or a 10-gallon tote or something of pesticides. If you've got larger quantities or like really a whole agricultural depot full of pesticides, Oregon Department of Agriculture separately organizes some agricultural waste pesticide disposal that's run through their pesticide stewardship partnership program. Scan this other QR code, and you'll get a link to that page. I did not see any of those scheduled yet for 2025. I know that they've happened occasionally in White City. Jackson Soil and Water Conservation District sometimes helps do that. You scan this QR code and you feel like you've got a bunch of pesticides to dispose of, you can work with the Pesticide Stewardship Partnership to set up one of those events back in the Road Valley to get rid of that material. And another sort of puzzle piece about pesticide disposal, and particularly because I chose this photograph, is that these two disposal methods that I am referring to are really for pesticides that are in their original containers, that are like sealed and safe in their original containers. This photograph that I found on Google gives us some question about how sealed and safe these materials are in these containers. And while I'm not totally sure I've like seen it, I can very well envision a like sort of musty and dusty kind of barn where somebody was keeping their pesticides and like left them there 30 years ago in their plastic or metal containers. And that some of those, there's a chance that some of those containers can leak or spill. And that ranges from, when that occurs, that ranges from a significant but handleable issue to a like kind of an emergency when pesticides spill. I hadn't been through this question about pesticide spills very like coherently, because when you Google pesticide spill, you get zoomed like straight to catastrophe. We need to bring in like a state response, and there's a chance that if you like walk into this pesticide barn, I guess I look at this photo and I see this sort of like greasy spot on the wood here. Is that a pesticide that leaked out of this very rusty drum of parathion? Or is that something else? If we were to like look under the floor of this at the soil under this wood floor, would we find that there is a like spot of something that looks a little oily? And the question is, that's a pesticide spill, has probably been there for a while and may not be a catastrophe. So let me tell you this, that uh, and I'll provide you with some contact information if these kind of things come up. Oregon runs a group that is called the Pesticide Analytical Response Committee, PARC, PARC. It is a like multi-agency group that responds to and investigates spills of pesticides, illegal use, when like weird stuff happens, they respond. My new friend Warren runs the park group, and Warren says to me this morning that if we're like walking into the barn and we find like a small like oily spot near the pesticide zone or something seems like it possibly has leaked, that doesn't necessarily need to be reported to this uh, pesticide analysis response committee. Potentially, you can deal with that on your own. And gets sort of complicated, but one choice is if you're not worried about it, leave it in place. If you don't think you've got kids or pets that are going to get into it, the hazardous waste rules come up when like you generate hazardous waste, and that means like taking something hazardous and like putting it into a new container. You've then generated hazardous waste. That said, if you walk into the pesticide room of this property that you're thinking about buying or you've just bought, and it becomes clear that there are some 55-gallon drums there that somebody like thought were full, but it turns out they've rusted through. And there's a really large quantity of material that may have entered into the environment. And you look around and you say, oh, kind of near a stream. I wonder if we're near a well. Are we in a floodplain such that if we had a significant storm, we'd see water running through here? Those like large quantities potentially have impacts on either natural water sources or like human sources of water. Larger quantities, we'd want to get in touch with the folks at Park. And again, I'll provide a link there as well. If it's a smaller quantity and you do feel like because for what that you need to clean it up, and we're talking about tens of pounds of material, not hundreds, and this is a uh, um, this is not a like the most intensive of commercial farm, but it's just the shed that you found that has some pesticides in it. You can, using appropriate protective gear, pick up that material, shovel it into a container, label it inside that impervious container, and take it to a place like one of the landfills there in Jackson County, and you will tell them that you have household hazardous waste and that it is pesticide contaminated soil, and there is a household hazardous waste exemption, and they will dispose of that for you. They may have some questions, but you don't necessarily spin up a big DEQ process and end up with a Superfund site, so long as it's, I think it was less than like 2,200 pounds of material. That said, if you're ever transporting pesticides, like need to be pretty cautious about how we do that. And most of like the spills and accidents that occur with pesticides are when they are in transport. And I guess I'd be particularly concerned about sort of sketchy containers like this. There are spill like containment kits that include things like kitty litter or equivalent that can absorb that material, include sort of like absorbent snakes that can help to contain the movement of that material. And I guess another puzzle piece that I should have shared with you but didn't is that often the labels themselves, if these are new pesticides in good condition, will provide some information about both storage and disposal of that pesticide. And so if it has a nicer label on it than this that you can peel off and read, would give you some instructions on what to do, as well as instructions on if it spills, how you need to clean it up. So a couple of like phone numbers and resources. If you just walked into a barn that looked like that and you're like, I've like never touched a pesticide in my life, and I'd sort of rather not, and I don't know exactly where to start. I'd probably start with a photograph of it and a discussion with the National Pesticide Information Center. This is run out of Oregon State University. It's a federally funded program. They have a hotline that is will answer questions about pesticides, help you evaluate the risk and know what precautions to take, and can point you in good directions with science-based information. As I mentioned, the label of that pesticide, if it's a modern enough one, they will almost always have a book of a label that is sort of taped onto that container. Peel that off, possibly with gloves on, and flip through that. There'll be some information on, again, safe storage and disposal. And almost always there'll be a phone number for the manufacturer of that pesticide. And they will take your phone call when you say, I don't know how to get rid of this. Can you help me? I don't know if it's safe for me to be near it or not. Manufacturer can answer that question about that product. If in any of this, we feel like there is a spill that occurs or an emergency that crops up, we need a different set of information. If there's like immediate or acute risk to life or safety, of course, we call 911. They can like direct you into appropriate systems to respond to these kind of like hazardous leak things. Poison Control Center, if folks have been exposed or are experiencing symptoms. I mentioned the Pesticide Analytical Response Center, PARC. We can call them when there are like big issues. Both 911 and PARC can spin up the Oregon Emergency Response System, which is another like multi-agency kind of response. And this is like when someone gets into a car accident when they're transporting a bunch of pesticides and they're spilling into the creek and onto the playground, that kind of response would occur. And then another group is called Chemtrek, and they can provide information on dealing and transporting pesticides as well. Not the nicest topic, not necessarily inherent to hemp or cannabis farms, but any farm that you might acquire or try to improve and bring up to snuff. It is possible that you find some pesticides there. We can dispose of them. We need to dispose of them safely. They like should not go down the drain, cannot just be dumped into soil, can't be diluted, need to be disposed of properly. And those instructions on how to do that, again, should be on the label of that material. If you don't have a label or need more information, get in touch with NPIC, this National Pesticide Information Center, and can find you the resources that you need. Looks like there's a question or two in the chat. Cool. And it looks like Nicole put the slides from this presentation in the chat box. So some of these phone numbers and stuff will be there. Let's see. At some point while I was down there working out of SOREC, I got a phone call from a veterinarian at OSU's veterinary like diagnostic hospital, where they had been sent a number of goats and deceased goats that had, let me get this right. I didn't fully make sense to me or why I was being called about it. What's called a phytobiozar. It's like a ball, and I should have included a photo here and I didn't. A ball of like a fiber that was stuck inside the stomach of these goats, and they were like not able to complete digestion because of it. And the folks in Corvallis at the veterinary hospital were like, Gordon, we've like never seen anything like this. Can you go out to this farm and look around for us and see what you can find that like might cause this issue? And I say like, hunting around farms for sketchy things isn't totally in the OSU extension agent job description. But, why not? If we can be helpful. So anyway, I went cruised up to this farm behind the Table Rocks, and the landowner was like, sure, yeah, my goats have been dying. You can look around. And so I looked around, and it was clear that this was a former hemp grow. And in the former hemp grow, we find plastic like this. This is like sheet plastic mulch that got left there and is sort of breaking down. We see some like chunks of some tote that might have fertilizer in it, or might have been a bag that somebody grew some cannabis in. yeah, probably if a goat were nibbling on this, it could be problematic for its digestion. These like balls of stuff that they were extracting out of the goats were not plastic though, so who knows? But there was evidence of plastic waste. Um, I go into the barn and I was like, oh, these are bags of fertilizer that have also been here for decades. Um, and um, Probably also not great for a goat. The challenge with the fertilizer is that we just don't know what it is. There's a chance that there's a tag there that would indicate percentages of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Um, and the whole deal with things like fertilizer or big piles of manure or like other stuff, sort of like nutrient rich stuff that occurs on farms, is runs the continuum of being like really beneficial for agricultural productivity to the other end of the continuum being a waste product that is a major and significant contaminant of groundwater, surface water, can be applied in such high doses that it can be toxic to crop plants, and probably not totally desirable to be in this state, spilling out of containers. Um, Fertilizers can go to the landfill. Whenever we're bringing like weird stuff to the landfill, probably wise to call them ahead of time, disclose what you're doing, make sure that they know how to route that material. Probably challenging to get this to the landfill unless you're gonna like shovel it into another container. There are analytical laboratories, like commercial analytical laboratories for not too many tens of dollars that will test fertilizers, and it's mostly for fertilizer manufacturers to understand what those labels on the bag should actually say, what those percentages are. But if you felt like you had a lot of one kind of fertilizer and were just curious and like, could this potentially actually be any good, and I could just spread it on my fields if I knew what it was, you could have a sample taken, send it to an analytical lab, and figure out if it's a nitrogen fertilizer or a blended fertilizer or lots of phosphorus, and decide if that has some agronomic or horticultural benefit to your farm. But you could also get rid of it. But this was a mess. I don't know if the goats were eating it or not. The next place I stopped on my tour of the farm was the like pile of like hemp stems, dead old hay, um, these kind of things like, are around. The hemp stems, this is like stems of some CBD plants, are difficult because they are kind of fibrous. They're not grown for fiber, but they're kind of fibrous. And are sort of slow to break down because of that. Um, that said, you can just compost them generally. In time, they will break down. It will be slow, sort of like trying to decompose. I don't know, just like woody stems of a shrub or something. It can be slow to break down, but can. I wonder if a goat could eat enough, chew on enough hemp stalks to create this funny issue. And while I was there, I was just like peering over the fence at what looked like sketchy cannabis grow. More acres than should have been a 1 acre marijuana grow wasn't on my list of licensed licensed hemp grows. And so, but like spent some good money on some infrastructure um for this. Don't I reported back to the veterinarians at the OSU Diagnostic Laboratory. I don't think they ever sorted out what was wrong with the goats. But anyway, for some reason that's the reason I have some weird pictures of some old cannabis farm stuff and was inspiring as I put this presentation together. Um, in the sort of like marijuana side of the cannabis side of the business, growing in these above ground totes where these are like individual bags where they've got like a spaghetti tube of irrigation, they've got some kind of potting mix. It's not soil from the ground that's made of sanded silt and clay, but it's something made out of uh, peat moss or core or like coconut shell, coconut husk stuff. And it's like fluffy and light in what you'd buy in a bag of potting mix. I'm not totally sure why the marijuana growers like feel like this is the right thing to do, but this is what the marijuana growers commonly, not in every case, commonly do. We'll do these above ground totes, and these are sort of smaller, holding just a couple cubic feet, but not uncommon to see a big like cubic yard kind of a tote. And in many cases, as we like arrive on these, they've harvested the plants. They've left us with um, some like plastic trash being irrigation system, possibly a greenhouse. These are like kind of nice ones. Um, and and then these bags full of potting mix. And in many cases, we find piles of that potting mix where folks were cycling through it, or have just these like sort of totes around. The plastic waste, again, if clean, there is at least one spot in Oregon where it can be recycled. Um, there's a chance that we would find a farmer somewhere within reasonable driving distance who might want a greenhouse that could be disassembled and sold to them on Craigslist or however else we get in touch with people who want to buy used stuff from us. The bags themselves, probably we need to ask the recycler if they would recycle them, but it's sketchy. Probably need to go into the landfill. But then you have this sort of like fluffy organic potting mix. And there's some question about what to do with that. Does that need to go into the landfill, or could you assess it well enough to feel confident that maybe you just actually put it into your like raised bed, or into your garden, or dump it into your compost pile to be mixed in with the next set of stuff. Um, we can't like guarantee that this is safe. I don't, nothing is perfectly safe. But how would we think about doing this sort of like assessment on, do I want to keep the potting mix that might be in one of these bags? Um, and this will be a topic that is relevant to this potting mix, but has some tie into this discussion about contaminated soil as well, and soil testing. And I will try to expound on the soil testing piece a little bit as well. But that said, this like potting mix is not inherently bad. It is a nice source of organic matter so long as it's not like been contaminated with something. And as we said, those legal marijuana and hemp growers, if they're following the rules, and lots, the vast majority were and did and do follow the rules. But there were some actors that were choosing to break the law and grow marijuana without a license to be able to ship out of the state. And I guess there's reason to believe that if someone is choosing to grow marijuana illegally and like evade those regulations from um, ODA and Oregon Liquor and Cannabis Commission, that there's a chance that they are also not following the rules about pesticides and pest control and other toxic things. It's hard to know, and can't all be bad, but there's a chance that there have at least been a small handful of reports in the news about illegal marijuana growers using off-label pesticides. And so it is a non-zero, but non-zero chance that something bad has happened. So if we've got this potting mix, or we have some soil or some compost that's left behind from the previous owner of this operation or manager of the operation, we might start by wanting to do some assessment of a physical assessment of it. If it is full of chopped up plastic mulch, or it looks like this thing where it's got like it's in really degraded shredded bags, where you're going to end up adding a bunch of like plastic or garbage to whatever you're working on, like maybe not super desirable. If it really like seems like it is rotten, it has been saturated, perhaps you'd not want to use that in your like front porch flower beds. And there's also some possibility that it's been like left in a place where it has accumulated, that there like weeds have been growing around it, that the like puncture vine has spread up and around and over this pile. And perhaps for those reasons, you can do this physical assessment just by like sort of looking and digging a little bit through this stuff and saying, like, not worth it. Not worth it for me to keep. We can do a routine soil test. And by routine soil test, this is one we would do in an agricultural field to understand the sort of like fertility or plant production capability of this soil potting mix. You can run through a standard soil test. There are also tests specifically for soilless media or this kind of potting mix, but we can run like an agricultural soil test, and that will look for things like the acidity or alkalinity, the pH of that, of that material. Nutrient levels, almost always are looking at least phosphorus and potassium. Really common to look at things like calcium and magnesium, micronutrients, boron, zinc, copper, iron, manganese, and sometimes some nutrients further down the chain. And one of the things that I would think about, particularly in potting mix that has come out of like a covered or closed greenhouse, are the salts that might have accumulated. Most of the time when we're if we're using conventional sort of like chemical fertilizers, those are in a like sort of salty form. And out in open fields, not a big deal. We get enough rain in the winter that that salt is easily leached through the soil out of the root zone of that of that plant. Not a big deal. We don't end up with sort of like salty field soils in the Rogue Valley. If you get into like the deserty parts of California or Oregon, where it like really doesn't rain that much in the winter, those salts can accumulate. Or if you cover that soil with a roof, such that winter rain doesn't arrive and doesn't wash nutrients through, you can accumulate salts. And so sometimes worry about soil getting like too salty in both in like house plants in your greenhouse and this kind of like compost that might or potting mix that might come out of one of those. Um, Someone remind me at the end, and I will provide you with a list of good labs that do this kind of routine soil testing. Um, there are other kinds of soil testing that can be done. You can test for heavy metals. Let me say this. This soil test costs $30, $40, $50 for one sample. We'd like go to a bunch of those bags within one of our greenhouses or go to our one big pile and pull out what is a representative sample from a few zones in there, set it off, 30, 40, $50. Um, we sometimes worry about things like heavy metals. We can test for those. Those tests get into the hundreds and can be in the many hundreds. Um, is there a chance that these cannabis growers have chosen to use some heavy metal based product? It's possible, but like pretty rare. The trick with heavy metals is that there are background levels of like the gnarly heavy metals, lead and arsenic that are naturally in soils. Um, Part of the legacy of orchard production in the Rogue Valley is the historic use of lead arsenate as an insecticide. We will find lead and arsenic around, and when we start to look for trace quantities of toxic materials, we get into a game of the analytical equipment will probably find some. It will be in the hopefully parts per mil or parts per billion or parts per trillion, but we can find it with that equipment, and it's a question of how much should be there and how much is safe or not. And there, in some cases, are the Department of Environmental Quality or Environmental Protection Agency provides a threshold. In other cases, they don't, and leaves us in this pickle of how do I proceed? I've got lots of numbers, but how do I proceed? Um, Something that I will talk about in more detail is a bioassay, which helps us to understand growth limitations. And another kind of testing that folks sometimes want to do is they want to go and take a sample of soil and test it for pesticides, run an analytical test for those chemicals and their breakdown products, and is either pesticides or can range into other things like oh, PCBs and some of those like fire retardant chemicals or what do you call it? Pressure treating kind of. There are like other environmental chemicals that are sort of like durable, and you can run a test for them. I am not in the business of recommending this kind of testing for landowners. Again, very expensive, hundreds to thousands of dollars for a pretty small set of contaminants. There are hundreds of organic and inorganic pesticides that like might possibly be in your soil. Uh, and one of these tests I was looking up was, I think it was $900, and it was going to test for 11 herbicides, and there are hundreds. Um, and again, chances are there's been sort of agriculture other than cannabis that has gone on in this place in the past, and that they've used pesticides, and including ones where, I don't know, there's a chance that if it was a pear orchard 65 years ago, we may well find some DDT in its breakdown products. Does not mean it is dangerous to you, may have nothing to do with the cannabis or hemp that was grown there. We could find really trace concentrations of some of these materials. Many break down over time, and particularly the organic ones, the things that aren't like lead or arsenic or inorganic. Many will break down with time, but we can find trace quantities of these things around. And for the want of what can be many thousands of dollars, to end up with results of really low levels of contamination just may not be the way you want to go um, unless you really think that you have good reason to test for a small set of chemicals. You've got a honed in problem. Some area really is bad, some area is good, and you want to do some differential testing. I tend not to be, I've not found myself in a situation where I felt like this kind of pesticide testing of soil or soilless media, compost potting mix is warranted. However, I do routinely recommend the bioassay. And so let me tell you about that. Um, we end up with a question of not, is there some parts per trillion of a scary sounding compound in my soil, in my potting mix, in my compost? But is there enough in there to like meaningfully affect the growth of that plant? That's where a bioassay comes in. It's like, let's let the plants tell us rather than analytical chemistry equipment. You'll get yourself 2 pots. In one of those pots, you're going to go to the Grange Co-op or Home Depot or wherever one goes and purchase some potting mix. You're going to take some of this sketchy old suspect potting mix, and you're going to get yourself one pot with new potting mix that's presumably is clean, and one with just stuff that is suspect. And you say, would this hurt my garden? If I spread this over my pasture, will it kill my grass? Get those pots. In those pots, we don't know what the fertility status is of this old potting mix. If it's been sitting out, it's probably been leached of nutrients. This new potting mix is probably going to come in like a yellow bag from Miracle Grow, though not necessarily. May have some fertilizer in it. So to make this fair, we're going to apply some general use fertilizer. My go-to, and no brand names recommended here by the university. One of my professors in graduate school, when we were doing orchard grass in the greenhouse, he was like, we're going to use Osmocote Plus. This is low release fertilizer. I have some here for my house plants. Put some fertilizer into both of my pots so we can make it not a soil fertility thing. There's enough nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium there to grow plants. Then we're going to get some seeds and basically some garden seeds. Maybe we want one grass seed, like an oat or a ryegrass. We get 2 plant families. So we get some solanaceous plants, maybe put a tomato seed in there and a bean seed. And we'll do that in both pots. Same packets of seeds. We're doing a little experiment here. Control everything except the soil. We will plant those seeds, we will water them, put them in a warm place, and let them grow for a while. If we let them grow for a while and what grows are equally healthy, then we say, oh, not too bad. Maybe this old potting mix is fine. Is somebody would pay top dollar to buy this to add it to their compost pile to amend their raised bed. Maybe it's fine. There's a chance that when those plants grow, some or all of them look kind of weird, are stunted, are off-colored, are kind of spiky, might look weird. Here's a photo of somebody, I think this came from North Carolina, doing a test with some tomatoes, pretty normal looking tomatoes, not the healthiest things in the world, in the left-hand pot, and sick and bleached and falling over tomatoes in the other side. Might be an indicator that we have an issue with that planting material. If this occurs, we then end up with this question of whether there are other disposal routes for this. Perhaps if you felt like this had occurred, there's one option is just to wait, leave it where it is. And again, many of these pesticides will break down over time. And perhaps they will break down over time with sun and water and microbial activity and being exposed to air. Could be to wait. Perhaps if you feel like this is an issue and you've got enough of it that you can't figure out how to dispose of it, maybe this would be a time that you would want to understand what that chemical was in the in that material that was causing this persistent issue. Can figure that out. Yeah, and in some cases, it sort of like depends that there's been contamination with a certain set of herbicides that get used on hay fields, and they are like they're really good at like killing the broadleaf weeds out of hay fields, but have the issue is that they accumulate in both hay and in manure of animals that eat that hay. People put it unknowingly into their compost piles, and this is all like best practice up and up, unrelated to cannabis or hemp or any of that stuff. And um, then go ahead and take that compost that had some treated hay as one of the feedstuffs for that compost and put it on their tomato plants. And it kills the tomato plants because it's a broadleaf herbicide. And aminopyrrolid, clopyrrolid, stinger, and transline come to mind as materials. They're good like thistle control. You might have that compost that you say, oh, when I do my little experiment here, it's killed my tomato and it's killed my bean, but my grasses that I planted are okay. You may make some decision, informed and thoughtful, that I'm going to spread this on my hayfield. It's not going to kill the grass in my hayfield. I'm not going to eat it directly. It'll be all right. We can spread it out and it's fine. But we need to have a pretty good understanding of what's going on in order to want to do that and not have some unintended knock-on effects that comes down the road. Let's see, I've been blathering on here for an hour and I have a handful more of slides to tell you about. There's a question of what we do next. We've gotten this sort of farm, the area cleaned up, and I know that I got lots of questions when I was down in the Rogue Valley. I'm like, I leased out this field to the hemp growers. They made a huge mess of it. Now what do I do? Perhaps you want to think about some like economic enterprise that you want to do something different than what was done before there. And so this is a nice resource called What Can I Do with My Small Farms? It helps you to think about what you might do. Perhaps because of this whole fiasco that occurred on this property, you ended up with a nice greenhouse or some different irrigation infrastructure that maybe actually is an asset to you, depending on what you want to do. This will help you to think about the resources that you have on your farm, your interests, your skills, and if there's what you might want to do. You can download that here. From my experience, like most of the land that went to be hemp farms, at least, were like pastures that were plowed up. They were either pastures or hay fields. There's rather nice pasture there in Central Point. Some were dry pastures. This is irrigated. In many cases, folks can't come to me and say, Gordon, we've tried to replant the pasture a number of times, and all we get are foxtail, Medusa heads, spreading hedge parsley. Is that what that plant's called? Gets like weeds. And how do I like get this back to be a nice pasture again? I'm going to give you the like fastest whirlwind tour of a way to replant pasture, because sometimes you just like, it would be nicer if we just had good grass there and it would keep the like gnarly bad ripgut brome foxtail Medusa head down if we had some good grass. How would we do that? It is it's a longer process, more complicated process than just planting pasture grass seed. I like to think about a 3-year time scale. And people don't like that, and it can maybe be 2.5 years, but it's sort of a long process. In year 1, we're going to spend like the spring and summer, like getting the junk out of the field. If there still is drip tape, cleaning up as much of that, any plastic that's still there, getting rid of just like debris, carcasses of hemp plants that are fibrous and haven't broken down. We'll do a soil test. And as I mentioned, this will be that routine soil test. I'll get you a list of labs here at the end during Q&A, where you can send those soil tests. Then in the fall, we might want to figure out what like how weedy is this? If it's for some reason it is like lovely and clean and is just soil, we might not need to do to kill existing vegetation, chances are this has grown weeds for a handful of years, and we need to kill those weeds either with a plow or a disc or by using a broad spectrum herbicide. And we want basically like dead material there, or clean soil, depending on a till or no-till strategy. There's some other options, particularly on smaller scales, that you can use. Talk to Scott Good about occultation and solarization as a no-till, no herbicide approach for small to moderate scales. And then in the fall, it makes sense to plant a smother crop or a cover crop. Our perennial pasture and hayfield grasses are pretty slow growing, and things like Medusa head, foxtail, and ripgut brome are fast growing. If we just sprinkle a bunch of orchard grass or tall fescue seed onto the ground that has a bunch of those weedy grass seeds, the weedy grass seeds win that competition and your pasture innovation fails. However, we can grow other agricultural crop plants. I'm suggesting forage barley, triticale, cereal rye is another option. Can blend it with a legume like crimson clover, Austrian winter pea. If you are really interested in soil health features of this, you might plant a diversified cover crop that includes a couple of these grains or grasses, a couple of legumes, and maybe a brassica, a radish, or a turnip. And that can help to feed microbial community. But the real reason that I would have you plant this cover crop is to smother out those weeds. Barley and triticale and these annual winter planted grain crops are fast growing. And so get this as smooth and even and clean as you can. Plant a fast growing crop, and this can get planted sometime between mid-September and probably mid-November. It will grow on winter rains through the winter. The cover crop is growing through the spring into the early summer of year 2. In the summer of year 2, go out and cut this crop for hay. If you just have a straight crop of triticale or barley, you can cut it for hay, bale it, and feed it to someone's cow. If you have a diversified crop out there that has some a bunch of legumes and some brassicas and some other things in it, it can be a little bit harder to dry down hay in that circumstance. If you can like borrow a bunch of cows, send the cows out there, harvest through grazing. It is also possible you could just flail mow this and drop it to the ground. You could also flail mow it, drop it to the ground, and incorporate it with some tillage. If some weeds grow after that, you might want to control those weeds. And it is only after we've planted at least one winter's worth of this smothering cover crop that I would ever recommend planting those slower growing perennial forages. It is often helpful to apply a little bit of fertilizer, be that conventional or organic, right at or just after planting. And come the following spring, we'll often grow some weeds with those grasses. We can clip with a mower, graze, or spray with a broadleaf herbicide, particularly if they're broadleaf weeds, can catch those in early spring. And then really for the first full summer, after that, need to like manage this pretty gently. It cannot be that we turn back out the whole herd of horses or flock of sheep or whatever it is. Need to manage very gently in the first year. And it really is not until year 4 of this process, or the second growing season of these perennial grasses, that we expect them to persist under the sort of like normal grazing. And there's all sorts of nuance to how you do that normal grazing to have that be successful, but well beyond the scope of this. There are lots of good resources, lots of good instructions in this resource called Pasture and Hayland Renovation for Western Washington and Oregon. QR code written by some Washington State folks, talks about forage species to plant. And then at the end of that document has some really nice recipe steps of like this kind of thing, and some variations on it. This is not like the law. You don't have to do a 3-year process. You can do something shorter and you can do something longer. But we're trying to reduce risk and increase chances of success on establishment of perennial plants, just so you get some like good ground cover that's less weedy. A lot of these hemp fields that you go into, somebody just walked away, or they said they told me they planted pasture mix and all I have is weeds. And doing this kind of cover crop, fast growing, smothering annual cover crop before you try to plant perennial grass, lawn, meadow, whatever it be, makes some good sense to increase chances of success. Um, we come to this point of planting perennial forages, and this will be my last 3 slides, and we'll do some discussion. Some question about what to plant. What we plant is really a question on, is this an irrigated or a dry land place? And if it is irrigated, we should plant like irrigated hay or pasture grasses. In most cases, pretty easy to do. Almost all of our pastures in the Rogue Valley that are irrigated are pretty well dominated by orchard grass and tall fescue. In some cases, we'll have some perennial ryegrass in them. Perennial ryegrass doesn't do that well in the Rogue Valley. We get too hot in the summer there. So you'll often find an irrigated pasture mix at a place like the Grange Co-op that includes these 3 species. The ryegrass will die out in a couple of years, and that's fine. If you're going to graze it for like beef cattle on pasture, getting some clover in there or some other legumes like bird's foot trefoil can be desirable and increase the protein and feed value of that forage. You can plant straight tall fescue if you want and like mow it like a lawn, and just like keep it low. But this kind of mix would be suitable also if you wanted to grow a crop to take a cutting or two of hay off of, or graze with sheep or cows or horses. However, if it is unirrigated or dry land, we arrive at a question that is like the bane of my existence in my 6 years in the Rogue Valley. It's just like really hard to get a well-established pasture, dry grassland that doesn't like pretty quickly become invaded by Medusa head, foxtail, ripgut, brome, the other stuff. It is just a real trick. And I've found myself being dissatisfied, encouraging growers to do all of the right steps, do my like long 3-year cycle of smother crops, killing the weeds, using herbicides, fertilizing, doing the right stuff, planting the most drought tolerant of the sort of normal tall fescues, or a dry land pasture mix, and like coming back in 16 months and just having it be annual grass weeds and none of the good stuff we planted. As I was wrapping up my time in Southern Oregon, I tried one more time at this question of what might we plant. And this, I got like halfway through an interesting experiment. I went and tried to say, can I look at all a real wide smattering of tall fescues varieties? And tall fescue is pretty drought tolerant as it is, but there's some variations in types of tall fescue. I did an experiment. Here I am standing next to what looks like a bunch of weeds, and then like maybe some tall grass. And we'll zoom in to the bottom of this, and we'll get charts that look like this. 2 of these types of tall fescue, I'm going to take you over to this right-hand chart, Chisholm and Timora, are like really like Mediterranean types of tall fescue that grew like, you know, in like Algeria or something, like right along the Mediterranean, really dry summers, uh, cool but not cold, wet winters. That's a lot like what we have in the Rogue Valley. When I planted those next to our like normal tall fescues, I planted them in the fall of 2022. I did not touch them in 2023, and I came back and I looked at them in May of 2024. Compared to everything else, the 2 of these summer dormant Mediterranean type tall fescues did a bunch better in terms of being like present and yielding well. Chisholm and Timora. And likewise, when I go to those plots and I visually estimate how much good grass versus how many weeds, Chisholm and Timora, like 70% good grass, just a little bit of weeds. All the other ones, miserably weedy. Um, I'm not sure if this is an answer. We've not really done enough on these summer dormant tall fescue varieties. If you go to the Grange and you ask them for this, chances are they won't know what you're talking about. I've shared some of this with Andy Smith, and so if you can find him, he might know what's up. You can order Timora online. I wouldn't plant my whole farm to this, but if I were down there and annoyed by weeds in my dry hayfield and was just trying to keep my EFU status, take one cutting of hay, sell it to some neighbors with some beef cows, I might be thinking about planting one of these summer dormant tall fescues. with that, we have time for questions. And here's my phone number in Central Oregon and my email address. And you all should also get to know, if you haven't already, Nan Shu is the new General Ag Extension faculty serving Jackson County, based at SOREC. I think she's on the call, and maybe we'll introduce herself in a moment. Nan is available. She and I work together closely. Hi, Nan. Do you want to introduce yourself really briefly? I don't know if you have permission to unmute yourself, but you're unmuted, but I can't hear you. Nan, I'm not hearing you, but Nan is the new general ag person. Welcome. Has been at SOREC since October 1st, really very new, learning a lot, interested in cover crops and organic soil management, and has a job description to work on lots of things. And call Nan. If she doesn't know the answer, she'll learn it, or call me, or we'll figure it out together. So with that, I will stop and we will see what there are for questions. I guess that's on me to look in here and read the questions.
Do you want to go back through some of the questions that were put in earlier?
Yeah, yep. Let's see. First, what I want to do is go see if I can find you my good list of soil testing labs. Because I've promised you that a couple of times.
Welcome, Nan. Sorry that you had some speaker issues. Would have been lovely to hear your voice.
Here's a list of soil testing labs that I've just put in the chat box. OSU is a little bit squirrely about us recommending soil testing labs, and that's because there are lots of labs, and we as OSU have not done any particular sort of like scientific assessment of the good ones and the bad ones. That said, any random lab you find in the phone book or on Google like may not serve you very well. This list of labs that I have compiled is a list of labs that participate in what is called the North American Proficiency Testing Program. And this is run by the Soil Science Society of America, where they send out like secret samples of soils to these labs, have the labs run like the standard methods, and send the results back. And if the results are like within the confidence interval of being right, the labs get this certification. If the labs are different than what the Soil Science Society of America thinks the right value is, they don't get the certification. And so I think I picked out like all of the labs in the West, I think, yeah, in the Western states that have this certification. And that helps me say that these are good labs. And like any like random person who's testing soil in their basement may not get the same results, and Nan or I may not be able to help you interpret them. These labs, we can help you interpret the results. Good labs. Let's see. What else do we have here? Is there a period of time where the life of these chemicals used on these grows can dissipate in potency? Janine, like, yes, there is. Almost all of these materials are sort of organic in that they're like not inorganic. They are compounds that can break down with light, water, air, microbial activity. However, the rate at which those things break down depends on the chemical, and it is so variable. And they will break down in a like half-life decay kind of way, where a a bunch will break down initially, and then half will break down, and then half will break down. And even 20 years later, you might find some tiny trace parts per trillion that is left if we were to do the test. And that's one of the reasons I don't like really recommend doing the test, because we can detect these really trace quantities of stuff that really are not biologically, ecologically, sort of health-wise significant. But it really depends on the chemical that's used. There is, um, unless you really have like reason to believe that sketchy or illegal materials were used, I guess I don't tend to think that they were. I've to a great degree that the hemp and cannabis growers that I've worked with are doing everything they can to grow a high quality and in many cases what they see as a therapeutic or medicinal or sort of like health product and are not in it to um, use cheap, illegal, sketchy, hazardous materials. But it is hard to know in any one case what might have occurred. Um,
Do you see the question from Clint about finding out permits that may or may not have existed for new structures, wells?
yeah, that's a good question, Clint. Right. Structures, wells, ponds, like what looks like legitimate irrigation infrastructure. Um, because it all sort of goes in different directions. The water, ponds, wells, and irrigate, and is it legal for me to keep irrigating? Um, those are all questions for the water master. And there is a Jackson County water master who's employed by the Oregon Department of Water Resources. And they are the ones who can look up the status of a pond. Can it be used for agricultural purposes? For a well? Can that be used for irrigation purposes? Or it looks like this has been being irrigated from some source. Can I actually irrigate this? If you've bought a new property or are going to buy a property and agricultural use of that water for commercial purposes is important, we check with the water master. We don't check with the real estate agent. We don't like check with the neighbor and be like, oh yeah, they've been irrigating out there for a few years. We check with the water master. They are the ones that can let you know if you have a legal water right to use that water for commercial use. You have a small allocation that you can use like in and around your home, but that cannot be for commercial use. Can't sell anything. Cannot be irrigating acres of land. And then on the like permits for structures, I was buddies with Alicia Brown down at like Jackson County Code Enforcement, and it would be like building department or code enforcement to ask that question about the uh, legitimacy of the buildings, I guess. And if you've acquired the property, probably important to figure that out, or you're going to when you like start to make some changes. Um, I guess my feeling about some of this, if you're in the like sort of process to purchase one of these properties that has some of the like signs of the echoing resonance of the cannabis industry, um, I would tend not to be super confident that my real estate agent has a full grip on permits for wells, for buildings, for electrical code violations. And if any of that stuff is just sort of giving you a question about is this all right, we'd probably want to go somewhere else. OSU Extension, County Code Enforcement, Water Master, kind of place where I don't care if you buy that property. I won't receive any commission or not if you do. Um, to ask those kind of questions, try to figure that stuff out before you purchase. And because there's a tiny bit of conflict of interest there with your real estate agent who would be delighted to sell you any parcel you wanted to buy. Um, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong with real estate agents. They're great. Um, um, let's see here. Sean's got a question about cover crops to help regenerate soil. Um, I guess I would say, and I've said it early on, I don't know that there is not any evidence that hemp is uniquely worse for soil than any other annual crop. The notion that we have to till up soil is something that is pretty common in hemp production. but it's also pretty common in like organic vegetable gardens is to till up soil. It's not required in either of those cases, but is kind of common. Um, Pretty wide range of cover crops that can grow well in the Rogue Valley, and because you're blessed with a relatively mild winter, can like get stuff to grow and get stuff to grow pretty well. Um, when I make recommendations about cover crops, it's, and I think I alluded to this, it's a couple of grasses or grains, it's a couple of legumes, and perhaps a brassica or two. If I want a diverse cover crop, with sort of regeneration of soil in mind, I'd like to lean towards the diversity. I might pick myself 3 or 5 or 7 species. I don't totally ascribe to the like hyper diverse cover crop cocktail thing where somebody's going to have you plant 30 species of cover crops. Um, in many of those cases, you don't actually end up growing a very even proportion of those 30 species. You just get the like 2 or 3 fastest growing that make up the um, majority of the biomass, and that's really what is functionally important is the biomass that's out there. Um, and you know, there's evidence in the literature that you don't necessarily see a huge benefit to a hyperdiverse cover crop, but like get yourself a handful of species from a handful of plant families, and a lot of them will grow pretty well. And I think you'll do all right. And to do that for a handful of years before you move into what your next thing might be. Um, um, Star Thistle from Pete, good question. Um, I think you should look to my land steward's recorded talk on troublesome weeds, which I think exists somewhere on YouTube. Star thistle is a tricky one. Um, we can battle it with herbicides. Stringer and Transline are good about keeping star thistle out. We know land stewards. Go talk to Ron Hiller about pulling star thistle. You can get on top of it and stay on top of it. It is a plant that does not like shade. If we can grow a fast-growing, smothering cover crop for a couple of years, that can really dramatically suppress populations. And I have no evidence, but I would be willing to bet that if you got a good crop of one of those summer dormant tall fescues growing that would be really winter active and suppressive at the time, providing some shade at the time when those star thistle plants are just getting going. I bet we would find fewer star thistle plants, or we do. We find fewer star thistle plants in any place where there's other good stuff growing. And so it's a question about what do you want to have there, and how can you help it get up and established and do that shading on the star thistle. Um, Out of the, I think it's out of somewhere in the UC system, there is the like Star Thistle Management Guide. Google that. It's like 150 pages long, really good resource, science-based, all sorts of integrated pest management tactics to deal with star thistle.
And then do you see Janine's question about where you can find permits and licenses online to see if the property was registered? I'd assume maybe that question is to find out if chemicals were used, thinking, if they were licensed, maybe they went
Uh,
by the book,
yep,
if they were or not.
yep. Um, Last that I asked, the marijuana grow sites, the cannabis grow sites, those are not public. For some reason, that the way that law was written is that is like a protected private piece of information. However, the locations of hemp grow sites are publicly available. Um, oh, Let me share my screen again in the last 45 seconds we have here. Um, ODA, hemp, Google search, bigger, bigger. Um, you go to the ODA hemp website, I think. Can you see my screen that I'm sharing? Um,
Yes.
I presume you can. Um, Oh, and they just made a new website like today. Um, um, this button, license things, this button, grow site contacts, just downloaded an XLS. Oh, hang on. Stop it. Stop it. Stop it. Just gave me a spreadsheet that looks like that, which you might be able to see. And you like zoom in on it. And these are like the locations and addresses and the names of the hemp grow sites. Um, and this is like current for 2024. On that same website we just looked at, you would be able to uh there's an email address and you could request the records from like 2018, 2019, when you were like really in the thick of when everybody was growing hemp, and you could see if there was a license to grow there. Um, Again, like licensed, not licensed, does that any of this like really imply use of anything that is concerning other than chances that there's shredded up plastic? It doesn't really. That there are plenty of hay growers, and historically there probably were some pear growers who were a little bit off label in what they were doing. There are folks who try to control the blackberries next to their fence that are dumping sketchy chemicals out in the world. And a lot of what we talked about and the way that we think about those things and can do that assessment is relevant to all those different kinds of land use. There is like nothing necessarily inherently bad about the hemp growers or make it more or less likely that something dangerous or illegal was done, but it's always a chance, sort of regardless. And um, Nicole, it looks like you found my managing troublesome weeds talk from a couple of years ago, and there's certainly some discussion in there about yellow star thistle.
Yes, that is within our community class recordings on the OSU Land Steward YouTube. I have one quick question thinking to, I think it was Janine or someone had asked about structures, getting rid of like water containment. If one were buying, like large water storage um, containers, is there anything to be concerned about with that, whether they're from a hemp farm or other, um, chemical wise?
Don't um I don't know that there's any reason to be particularly concerned, one way or the other, that like whenever you're buying something used from somebody else, um, there's both some like assessment that you could do, like stick your head in this thing and assess how clean it seems and put your hand in there. And is there like weird residue that comes off from the inside of the container? But then there's another piece about like the person you're buying it from and how you interact with them and how trustworthy they seem. And in some cases, it makes sense to buy things for people who you would not want to interact with again in the future. But as we get into some of these kind of questions, in some cases making some, if we have two options and the one person seems to be really forthright and will share with you all the things they know about a product you're about to buy or a parcel of land or a something piece of infrastructure, um, I think that that makes sense to use your like common sense stranger danger or whatever that's called, to do some of that, because some piece of this whole puzzle is, um we don't necessarily know what's happened in the past, and we have to use our skills to trust and evaluate and assess some risk. But I don't know any examples of like real contamination that would occur in those things, and that couldn't be well rinsed or scrubbed or detergented out. Um,
Perfect. Thank you. I'm just thinking of how some of the former hemp and cannabis grow sites are, selling some of those water catchment, and some folks might be looking like we are to catch some rainwater and store it.
right, chances are like slimy algae. Some chance, not would not be the best recommended practice, but in some cases, folks would put put fertilizer, want that sort of injected into their irrigation water to go out into their drip tubes or their irrigation system. But fertilizer is mostly just like food for slime to grow in the tank and again get scrubbed out. I don't, yeah. And somebody might be putting an algicide, an algae killer into that tank to keep the slime from growing. But again, like rinsed really well. Probably not drinking that water. Regardless, just generally those aren't potable water systems, but yeah.
Great.
That's
Thank you. Are there, I know we're a little bit over and I don't want to use up too much more of your time, but are there any last little questions in here, Gordon, if you don't mind?
yeah. Presumably there are, but I've not, yeah, if there aren't,
I haven't seen any come through yet, but just
and I
wanted to
guess
get.
I skimmed through it, but we may have actually made it through the whole list here. So good to be with you this evening and a pleasure to see familiar names and have good interaction from you all. If you have questions on this stuff, don't hesitate to reach out to me or to Nan, or some of the resources that we provided. Happy to point you in the right direction, and good luck.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Gordon. And I made sure I saved your soil, the testing labs as well. So I'll send that out along with your presentation and a link to this presentation for folks as well. So thank you so much for taking the time and for coming back out for another Land Steward program.
My pleasure.